History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7 The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 4 The Ottoman Heritage and the Western Islamic Lands. Under such strain, it was soon apparent that the post reform harmony among the peoples to which liberals had looked forward was a chimera. Religion, language, social custom, and nationality still fragmented even what was left of the empire. The young Turks were driven back more and more upon the assertion of one nationalism among many, that of the Ottomans. This, of course, led to resentment among other peoples. The result was once more a massacre, tyranny, and assassination. The time honored instruments of rule at Constantinople from 1913. They were deployed by a triumvirate of young Turks who ruled as a collective dictatorship until the outbreak of the Great War. Though they had disappointed many of their admirers, these men had the future on their side. They represented the ideas which would one day remake the Ottoman heritage, nationalism and modernization. They had even willy nilly done something towards this by losing most of the little that was left of the Ottoman Empire in Europe, thus releasing themselves from a burden, but their heritage was still too encumbering in 1914. Before them lay no better alternative as a vehicle for reform than nationalism. How little pan Islamic ideas would mean was to be shown by what happened after 1914 in the largest remaining bloc of the Ottoman territory, the largely Muslim provinces of Asia. In 1914, these covered a large and strategically very important area. From the Caucasus, the frontiers with Persia ran down to the Gulf near Basra, at the mouth of the Tigris. On the southern shore of the Gulf, Ottoman rule ran around Kuwait with an independent sheikh and under British protection, and then back to the coast as far as Qatar. From here, the coasts of Arabia, right around the entrance of the Red Sea, were in one way or another under British influence. But the whole interior and Red Sea coast were Ottoman. Under British pressure, the Sinai Desert had been surrendered to Egypt a few years before, but the ancient lands of Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia were still all Turkish. This was the heartland of historical Islam, and the Sultan was still Caliph, its spiritual ruler. This heritage was to crumble as the strategy and politics of world war played upon it. Even within the historic Islamic heartland, there had been signs before 1914 that new political forces were at work. In part, they stemmed from old established European cultures and influences, which operated in Syria and the Lebanon much more strongly than in Egypt. French influence had been joined in those countries by American missionary efforts and the foundation of schools and colleges to which there came Arab boys, both Muslim and Christian, from all over the Arab world. The Levant was culturally advanced and literate. On the eve of the World War, over 100 Arabic newspapers were published in the Ottoman Empire outside Egypt. An important crystallization had followed the triumph of the Young Turks and their Ottomanization tendencies. Secret societies and open groups of dissidents were formed among Arab exiles, notably in Paris and Cairo. In the background was another uncertain factor: the rulers of the Arabian Peninsula, whose allegiance to the Sultan was shaky. The most important of them was Hussein Sharif of Makkah, in whom, by 1914, the Turkish government had no confidence. A year earlier, there had been the ominous sign of a meeting of Arabs in Persia to consider the independence of Iraq. Against this, the Turks could only hope that the decisiveness of the different interests represented among the Arabs would preserve the status quo. Finally, although it did not present an immediate danger, the latest converts to the culture of territorial nationalism were the Jews. Their history had taken a new turn when, in 1897, there appeared a Zionist Congress whose aim was the securing of a national home. Thus, in the long history of Jewry, assimilation still barely achieved in many European countries after the liberating age of the French Revolution was now replaced as an ideal by nationalism. The desirable location had not at once been clear. Argentina and Uganda were suggested at different times, but by the end of the century, Zionist opinion had come to rest finally on Palestine. Jewish immigration there had begun, though still on a small scale. The unrolling of the war was to change its significance. Curious parallels existed between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires in 1914. Both sought war, seeing it in part as a solution to their problems. Yet, both were bound to suffer from it because too many people inside and outside their borders saw in war an opportunity to score at their expense. In the end, both empires were to be destroyed by it. Even at the outset, Russia, the historic enemy, seemed likely to benefit since Turkey's entry to the war evaporated the last of the tradition of resistance of the British and French to the establishment of Tsarist power at Constantinople. For their part, the French had their own fish to fry in the Middle Eastern pan. Though their irritation over a British presence in Egypt had subsided somewhat with the making of the Entente and a free hand for France in Morocco, there was a tradition of a special French role in the Levant. The evocations of St. Louis and the Crusaders, with which some enthusiasts made play, did not have to be taken seriously, but undeniably, French governments had for 100 years claimed to exercise a special protection of Catholicism in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Syria, to which Napoleon III had sent a French army in the 1860s. There was also the cultural predominance evinced by the wide use of the French language among the educated in the Levant, and much French capital was invested there. These were not forces which could be overlooked. Nevertheless, in 1914, Turkey's main military antagonists outside Europe were likely to be Russian in the Caucasus and the Great Britain at Suez. The defense of the canal was the foundation of British strategic thinking in the area, but it soon became clear that no great danger threatened it. Nevertheless, in 1914, Turkey's main military antagonists outside Europe were likely to be Russia in the Caucasus and Great Britain at Suez. The defense of the canal was the foundation of British strategic thinking in the area, but it soon became clear that no greater danger threatened it. Then events occurred revealing new factors which would in the end turn the Middle and Near East upside down. At the end of 1914, an Indian British army landed at Basra to safeguard oil supplies from Persia. This was the beginning of the interplay of oil and politics in the historical destiny of this area, though it was not to show itself fully until well after the Ottoman Empire had ceased to exist. On the other hand, an approach which the British governor of Egypt made to Hussein in October 1914 bore fruit very quickly. This was the first attempt to use the weapon of Arab nationalism. The attraction of striking a blow against Germany's ally became all the greater as fighting went on bloodily but indecisively in Europe. An attempt in 1915 to force the Dardanelles by combined naval and land operations in the hope of taking Constantinople became bogged down. By then, Europe's civil war had already set in trained forces one day to be turned against her, but there was a limit to what could be offered to Arab allies. Terms were not agreed with Hussein until the beginning of 1916. He had demanded independence for all the Arab lands south of a line running along the 37th degree of latitude. This was about 80 miles north of a line from Aleppo to Mosul and included in effect the whole of the Ottoman Empire outside Turkey and Kurdistan. It was much more than the British could take at the gallop. The French had to be consulted too, because of their special interest in Syria. When an agreement was made between the British and French on spheres of influence in a partitioned Ottoman Empire, it left many questions still unsettled for the future, including the status of Iraq, but an Arab nationalist political program looked like becoming a reality. The future of such undertakings was soon in doubt. The Arab revolt began in June 1916 with the attack on the Turkish garrison of Medina. The rising was never to be more than a distraction from the main theaters of war, but it prospered and became a legend. Soon the British felt they must take the Arabs more seriously. Hussein was recognized as the king of Hijaz. Their own troops pressed forward in 1917 into Palestine, taking Jerusalem. In 1918, they were to enter Damascus together with the Arabs. Before this, though, two other events had further complicated the situation. One was the American entry into the war. In a statement of war aims, President Wilson said he favored an absolute, unmolested opportunity of development for the non-Turks of the Ottoman Empire. The other was the Bolshevik publication of their predecessors' secret diplomacy. This revealed Anglo-French proposals for spheres of influence in the Middle East. One part of this agreement had been that Palestine should be administered internationally. Another irritant was added when it was announced that the British policy favored the establishment of a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration can be accounted the greatest success of Zionism down to this time. It was not strictly incompatible with what had been said to the Arabs, and President Wilson had joined in the good work by introducing to it qualifications to protect Palestinians who were not Jews. But it is almost inconceivable that it could ever have operated unchallenged, especially when further British and French expressions of goodwill towards Arab aspirations followed in 1918. On the morrow of Turkish defeat, the outlook was thoroughly confused. Hussein was at that moment recognized as the king of Arab peoples by Great Britain, and this did little for him. It was not Arab nationalists but the British and French, with the help of the League of Nations, who were to lay out the map of the modern Arab world. During a confused decade, the British and French then became embroiled with the Arabs whom they had themselves conjured onto the stage of world politics, while the Arab leaders quarreled among themselves. The mirage of Islamic unity once more faded away, but mercifully, so did the Russian threat, even if only briefly, and only two great powers were left engaged in the Middle East. They distrusted one another but could agree roughly on the basis that if the British had their way in Iraq, the French could have theirs in Syria. This was legitimized by the League of Nations awarding mandates for Arab lands to them. Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq went to the British and Syria to the French, who governed high-handedly from the start, having to install themselves by force after a national congress had asked for independence, or a British or American mandate. They evicted the king of the Arabs, Hussein's son, and subsequently had to face a full-scale insurrection. The French were still holding their own by force in the 1930s, though there were by then signs that they would concede some power to the nationalists. Unfortunately, the Syrian situation soon also showed the disintegrating power of nationalism when the Kurdish people of North Syria revolted against the prospect of submergence in an Arab state, so introducing to Western diplomats another Middle Eastern problem with a long life before it. The Arabian Peninsula was meanwhile racked by a struggle between Hussein and yet another king with whom the British had negotiated a treaty. His followers, to make things more difficult still, were members of a particularly puritanical Islamic sect who added religious to dynastic and tribal conflict. Hussein was displaced, and in 1932, the new Kingdom of Saudi Arabia emerged in the place of the Hijaz. From this flowed other problems, for sons of Hussein were, by this time, kings of Iraq and Transjordan. After heavy fighting had shown the difficulties ahead, the British had moved as fast as they dared towards the ending of the mandate over Iraq, seeking only to secure British strategic interests by preserving a military and air force presence. In 1932, accordingly, Iraq entered the League as an independent and fully sovereign state. Earlier, Transjordan had been recognized as independent by the British in 1928, again with some retention of military and financial powers. Palestine was much more difficult. From 1921, when there were anti-Jewish riots by Arabs alarmed over Jewish immigration and Jewish acquisition of Arab land, that unhappy country was never to be long at peace. More was at stake than merely religious or national feeling. Jewish immigration meant the eruption of a new westernizing and modernizing force, its operation changing economic relationships and imposing new demands on a traditional society. The British mandatory power was caught between the outcry of the Arabs if it did not restrict Jewish immigration, and the country was filled with the outcry of the Jews if it did. Arab governments now had to be taken into account too, and they occupied lands which were economically and strategically important to British security. World opinion was becoming involved. The question became more inflamed than ever when in 1933 there came to power in Germany a regime which persecuted Jews and began to take away the legal and social gains they had been making since the French Revolution. In 1937, there were pitched battles between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Soon, a British army was trying to hold down an Arab insurrection. The collapse of the paramount power in the Arab lands had often in the past been followed by a period of disorder. What was unclear this time was whether disorder would be followed, as earlier periods of anarchy had eventually been, by the establishment of a new imperial hegemony. The British did not want that role. After a brief spell of imperial intoxication in the aftermath of victory, they desired only to secure their own fundamental interests in the area. The protection of the Suez Canal and the swelling flow of oil from Iraq and Iran. Between 1918 and 1934, a great pipeline had been built from northern Iraq across Transjordan and Palestine to Haifa, thus giving yet another new twist to the future of these territories. The consumption of oil in Europe was not yet so large that there was any general dependence on it, nor had the great discoveries been made which would again change the political position in the 1950s. But a new factor was making itself felt. The Royal Navy had turned over to oil for its ships. The British believed Suez to be the best secured by keeping forces in Egypt, but this caused increasing trouble. The war had intensified Egyptian feeling. Armies of occupation are never popular. When the war sent up prices, the foreigner was blamed. Egyptian nationalist leaders attempted in 1919 to put their case to the Paris Peace Conference, but were prevented from doing so. There followed a rising against the British, which was quickly put down. But the British were in retreat. The Protectorate was ended in 1922 in the hope of getting ahead of nationalist feeling. Yet the new Kingdom of Egypt had an electoral system which returned nationalist majority after nationalist majority, thus making it impossible for an Egyptian government to come to terms for safeguarding British interests, which any British government would find acceptable. The result was a prolonged constitutional crisis and intermittent disorder until 1936. The British finally agreed to be content with a right to garrison the Canal Zone for a limited number of years. An end was also announced to the jurisdictional privileges of foreigners. This was part of a British retreat from empire which can be detected elsewhere after 1918. It was in part a reflection of an overstretching of power and resources as British foreign policy began to be preoccupied by other challenges. Changes in the world relationships far from the Middle East thus helped to shape post-Ottoman developments in the Islamic lands. Another novel factor was Marxist communism. During the whole of the years between the wars, Russian radio broadcasting to the Arab countries supported the first Arab communists. But for all the worry they caused, communism showed no sign of being able to displace the strongest revolutionary influence of the area, still that of Arab nationalism, whose focus had come by 1938 to be Palestine. In that year, a congress was held in Syria to support the Palestinian Arab cause. Arab resentment of the brutality of the French in Syria was beginning to be evident too, as well as an Arab response to the outcry of the Egyptian nationalists against the British. In pan-Arab feeling lay a force which some thought might in the end override the divisions of the Hashemite kingdoms. Allied agreements during the war also complicated the history of the Ottoman homeland, Turkey, as it was soon to be renamed itself. The British, French, Greeks, and Italians had all agreed on their shares of the booty. The only simplification brought by the war had been the elimination of the Russian claim to Constantinople and the Straits. Faced with French, Greek, and Italian invasion, the Sultan signed a humiliating peace. Greece was given large concessions. Armenia was to be an independent state, while what was left of Turkey was divided into British, French, and Italian spheres of influence. This was the most blatant imperialism and a far harsher settlement than that imposed on Germany at Versailles. To drive home the point, European financial control was re-established. There followed the first successful revision of any part of the peace settlement. It was largely the work of one man, a former young Turk and the Ottomans' only victorious general, Mustafa Kemal, who drove out the French and Greeks in turn after frightening away the Italians. With Bolshevik help, he crushed the Armenians. The British decided to negotiate, and so a second treaty was made with Turkey in 1923. It was a triumph of nationalism over the decisions at Paris, and it was the only part of peace settlement which was negotiated between equals and not imposed on the defeated. It was also the only one in which Russian negotiators took part, and it lasted better than any of the other peace treaties. The capitulations and financial controls disappeared. Turkey gave up her claims to the Arab lands and the island of the Aegean, Cyprus, Rhodes, and Dodecanese. A big exchange of Greek and Turkish populations followed. 380,000 Muslims left Greece for Turkey, and 1.3 million Orthodox Christians left Turkey for Greece, and thus the hatred of these peoples for one another was reinforced. Yet, in the light of subsequent events, this outcome could be reckoned one of the more fruitful exercises in ethnic cleansing in the region, leaving a less dangerous situation behind it than it found. So, the Ottoman Empire outside Turkey was wound up after 6 centuries. A new republic then came into existence in 1923 as a national state. Appropriately, the Caliphate followed the empire into history in 1924. This was the end of the Ottoman era. Of Turkish history, it was a new beginning. The Anatolian Turks were now, for the first time in 5 or 6 centuries, the majority people of their state. Symbolically, the capital was moved from Istanbul to Ankara. Kemal, as he tended to call himself, the name meant perfection, was something of a Peter the Great, though he was not interested in territorial expansion after the successful revision of the dictated peace, and something of a more enlightened despot. He was also one of the century's most effective modernizers. The law was secularized on the model of the Napoleonic Code. The Muslim calendar abandoned, and in 1928, the constitution was amended to remove the statement that Turkey was an Islamic state. To this day, she remains the only Middle Eastern country with a Muslim population to adopt the principle of secularism. Polygamy came to an end. In 1935, the weekly day of rest, formerly Friday, the Islamic holy day, became Sunday, and a new word entered the language: weekend, the period from 1 p.m. Saturday to midnight Sunday. Schools ceased to give religious education. The fez was forbidden. Although it had come from Europe, it was considered Muslim. Kemal was conscious of the radical nature of modernization he wished to achieve, and such symbols mattered to him. They were signs, but signs of something very important: the replacement of traditional Islamic society by a European one. One Islamic ideologist urged his fellow Turks to belong to the Turkish nation, the Muslim religion, and European civilization, and did not appear to see difficulties in achieving that. The alphabet was Latinized, and this had great importance for education, henceforth obligatory at the primary level. A national past was rewritten in the school books. It was said that Adam had been a Turk. Kemal, on whom the National Assembly conferred the name of Ataturk, or Father of the Turks, was an immensely significant figure. He was what Mehmet Ali perhaps wanted to be, the first transformer of an Islamic state by modernization. He remains strikingly interesting. Until his death in 1938, he seemed determined not to let his revolution congeal. The result was the creation of a state in its day, and in some ways among the most advanced in the world. In Turkey, a much greater break with the past was involved in giving a new role to women than in Europe, and in 1934, Turkish women received the vote. They were encouraged too to enter the professions.